These scary, haunted locations have attracted visitors from around the world who want to take part in so-called dark tourism. Ghosts and the unexplained are things that many people are keen to see for themselves, just to prove that they're brave enough to face their fears or to prove that the supernatural actually exists. But doing so could be a risk, especially in locations where the ghosts aren't as friendly as could be hoped. Number 5. The National Emergency Services Museum in Sheffield, England, is the world's biggest combined emergency services museum. Housed in an old police and fire station, the museum is home to thousands of objects that shows how crime, fires, and other emergencies were tackled over the centuries. But it's also said to be home to a number of dark entities. In the late 1800s, the decision was made to move the local police and fire services into the same building. It would be the first joint station of its kind, and was designed by architect Joseph Norton. The left side of the ground floor was allocated to the police service, and including a corridor of prison cells. The rest of the building was to be utilized by the fire department. It also had living quarters and a watchtower that could see for 2 miles. Work on the site began in 1897 and included all the latest technology, including a fireman's pole. It would open in 1900 and was designed to be an example of what an efficient emergency services station could look like. All the latest technology couldn't account for the increase in the size of fire vehicles though, and in 1924, the fire service had to move out of the building and find a new place to house the engines. The police remained at the West Bar Station until 1965. During that time, it had seen a lot of suffering. Crime was on the rise in Sheffield. In fact, the police station was built during the Sheffield Gang Wars, when organized crime took hold of the city. In the early 1900s, one of those gangs, the Mooney Gang, operated out of the West Bar during the 1920s, and members of a variety of gangs were brought to the West Bar station during the prolonged wars. It's safe to say that a large number of violent people lived around and passed through the police station. It wasn't only the local trouble that would leave its mark on the West Bar station. It survived both world wars, including the Blitz of Sheffield during December of 1940. Shrapnel from the attacks is still embedded in the museum walls today. In 1965, the police moved to a different location on the same street, and the building went through a number of iterations before becoming a museum in 1983. But as collections of memorabilia were gathered at the location, volunteers quickly learned they weren't the only ones using the museum. There are 2 main focuses for the activity at the National Emergency Services Museum. The first is one of the police holding cells. Countless violent criminals would have been held here during the 60s when the station was in service, as well as other less violent criminals. One of those was a man who went by the name of Cain. There isn't a whole lot of information about who Cain was in life. He may have been called Charles, with Cain being either a surname or a nickname. Some sources claim he spent a long period of time at the police station. However long he spent here in life, he's apparently decided to make it his home after he passed away. Just going down into the cells can cause a feeling of despair and depression. The museum organizes ghost hunts, and many people have come up from the cells feeling nauseous. At least one person actually fainted. Cain is usually found in his cell at the end of one of the corridors. He'll apparently talk to mediums and is happy to make his presence known through knocks and disembodied footsteps. But he's also an angry spirit. He doesn't like it when people enter his cell, and in particular, he doesn't like female visitors. He's known to throw objects as well as causing a feeling of dread. But Cain isn't the only dark presence at the museum. The first floor of the museum once housed the fireman's bedroom, where firefighters could come and sleep during their shifts. The museum has dressed the room as it would have been in use and has a dummy in place as a sleeping firefighter. It's around here that a particularly dark entity lurks. Museum staff has described the corridor outside the room growing dark for no reason, before an even darker shadow appears. Others have described shadows moving past doorways when there should have been nobody there, dark smoke or fog moving along the floor, and unexpected scratches. What this entity isn't clear. Some believe it may have been the dark, lost soul of someone who lived in the area at one point, while others believe it was never human at all. The National Emergency Services Museum is regularly voted one of the most haunted locations in the UK, and it's not surprising that it's appeared on TV shows focusing on the paranormal. In 2014, the TV show Most Haunted visited the museum. During the investigation, it was in this fireman's bedroom that most of the activity was focused, with objects being thrown about the room, a shadow moving past the door, and the sound of footsteps and taps. At one point, the group picked up the scent of something that smelled like smoke from a fire that had just been put out. Shortly afterwards, one of the crew heard footsteps that nobody else could hear. The camera suddenly switched off, and the crew member decided to leave the investigation early. He wouldn't return to the show. The activity isn't limited to these two entities. The ghosts of other prisoners and people who worked at the station are still believed to haunt the walls of the museum as well. One ghost that has supposedly been identified is a man named Jack Robinson, born in 1927, who was a firefighter and footballer. Another spirit that's seen is said to be the ghost of a pickpocket. A local newspaper also claimed the spirit of Spitfire pilot Gerald Harper is still at the museum, but it's not clear what attachment he had to the location or emergency services. It's possible that somebody who never set foot in the museum in life may have become trapped there afterward. West Bar was originally just a home to a regional emergency services system, but as it grew, it took on collections from around the country. While ghosts are typically attached to a single location, it's not unheard of for a ghost to be attached to objects. In particular, there are a large number of vehicles that are part of the exhibitions, including ambulances. Not everybody who took a trip in an ambulance would make it to the hospital alive, and it's possible their spirit became attached to that vehicle. At night, it's not uncommon for people to see ghostly figures behind the steering wheels of various trucks and vehicles that make up the museum's collection. Others have heard voices coming from empty vehicles. The museum is still open for ghost hunting groups. Anybody hoping to catch a glimpse of any of the friendly or unfriendly ghosts is welcome to try to spend the night, but it isn't a trip for the faint-hearted or unprepared. Number 4. Yuma Territorial Prison was only open for 33 years between 1876 and 1909. In that time, 3,069 prisoners stayed at the prison, and more than 100 didn't come out. The prison was so horrific that on multiple occasions, prisoners were transported straight from the prison to mental health facilities. The terrible actions that happened here during its short period of operation have left an imprint on the location itself. Even without stories of the supernatural, Yuma Territorial Prison is a disturbing place to visit. When the prison was first opened, Arizona was not yet a state. Yuma was a frontier land, a crossing point for people traveling to California for the gold rush. This was still the Wild West, and while many of the people who came to Yuma did so in hopes of starting a new life for themselves, others saw this as a lawless land of opportunity. To say the prison opened in 1876 would be misleading. This is when it began operation. The prison would be located on the northern edge of Yuma, where the Colorado River splits what is today Arizona and California. It was built into bluffs above the river, and the first prisoners built the prison themselves. The small, claustrophobic cells were carved out of the rock. The thick stone walls offer some protection from the Arizona heat, but there was little else that made the cells a pleasant place to stay. 6 prisoners would be held in each cell, in 2 sets of iron bunk beds. The beds would take up 2/3 of the small cells, with only a narrow walkway separating them. Some cells would double up, with 12 people in the enclosed spaces. Other buildings, including a hospital, would later be built over the top of the cells, creating an even more enclosed feeling. There was also a watchtower that still stands today, looking out at the prisoners. Some of the most terrifying people in the area were locked up in the prison. Crimes could range from something as simple as polygamy to taking the lives of others, though grand larceny was the most common crime that landed people in Yuma. Yuma Territorial Prison earned 2 contradicting nicknames. The first was the Yuma Country Club. The wife of one superintendent, Medora Ingalls, started a library at the prison with books, newspapers, and magazines. It was designed to keep the prisoners occupied, Hard labor and work details were common at the prison but not constant. The library gave them something to do when they weren't working, and occupied people are less likely to cause trouble. While Yuma was built in an era of harsh treatments for those behind bars, it was also built at a time when reforms were starting to occur, with new ideas for how to keep criminals off the streets. There was later electricity installed, and it seemed from the outside that the prison was more luxurious than the town of Yuma. But while a library and other activities were a carrot to get the prisoners to behave, there was also a stick which earned the prison its other nickname, the Hellhole. In 1894, another hole was dug into the rocks on the south side of the prison. A chamber of 16 feet by 15 feet was dug into the rock, with a narrow corridor leading to the outside. A shaft was also dug from above so that light could come in. This room was given the name the Dark Cell, or the Snake Pit, and it was here that misbehaving prisoners would be sent. Prisoners would be chained to iron rings inside a cage in the room, wearing only their underwear. They were given water and some bread each day, but nothing else. Some prisoners would only spend a day or two in the dark, horrifying hold. Others could spend weeks or even months in isolation. The room earned the name the Snake Pit due to the creatures that would sometimes join the prisoners in the hole. Snakes and scorpions were common, and there was a rumor that sadistic guards would drop the creatures into the hole from above. Unsurprisingly, there were many prison escape attempts, and a number of people lost their lives trying to get out to freedom. In particular, there was the 1887 Gates Riot, which led to 4 inmates losing their lives. But most of the people who passed away at the prison did so due to disease. Tuberculosis was common at the time, and the crowded conditions meant it spread even quicker. A few people lost their lives due to violence from other prisoners. A prisoner named Francisco Garcia took the life of Simon Aldrete in 1903 and would have his own life taken not long after. There's a prison cemetery that still stands today, where many of those who lost their lives at the prison would be laid to rest. In 1909, a new prison was built. By this point, overcrowding had made Yuma unsustainable, and prisoners were transported to the other prison. The site then housed a high school for a brief period and was inhabited by homeless during the Great Depression. The site would become a museum in 1941 and later a state park. While most visitors today come for the history, there is some history that feels more alive than others. There are a number of ghosts and paranormal anomalies said to occur at the prison. One of the most commonly cited ghosts is that of a man named John Ryan. Ryan was imprisoned for crimes against nature in 1900. Ryan was disliked by guards and inmates alike, and his life ended behind bars. He still haunts cell 14, where his life ended. He's sometimes seen as a light white glow with shining eyes. Others feel a cold chill walking past the cell, or a shadow seen out of the corner of the eye. But it's not only prisoners who have become attached to this location. One of the other frequently reported spirits is that of a little girl in a red dress. She's believed to have lived at the location during the Great Depression, and is known to pinch or touch people wearing red clothing. Some have also heard her crying. Another spirit has made its home in the gift shop and will throw coins from the cash register. The spirit of a woman is also sometimes seen around the river, looking for her child. She may be the mother of the girl in the red dress. A prison guard still watches over the prison from the guard tower long after his final shift, and he's picked up on EVPs responding aggressively. Of course, the main source of paranormal activity is believed to be the dark cell. One story states that a local reporter attempted to spend 48 hours locked up in the cell. 11 hours short of her target, she called out asking to be let out. She stated that she didn't feel as if she was alone in the cell. The spooky factor earned Yuma Territorial Prison a high ranking on the list of the most haunted locations in the US. It wasn't a place that anybody wanted to be when it was in operation. Today, it welcomes tourists and visitors every day, but those wanting to catch a glimpse of something paranormal after hours should be prepared for the experience. Number 3. Haunted tunnels can be found around the world. There's something unsettling about traveling through an underground or enclosed space, where it might be easy to become trapped and difficult for help to arrive. The narrow opening means someone or something could always be hiding just out of sight, waiting to attack once you emerge from the tunnel. It's not surprising that everywhere from Canada to Switzerland has a haunted tunnel. Japan may have more haunted tunnels than most, though. With the mountainous terrain, it has a high number of tunnels in general. Japan is also now famous for its ghost stories, with some of the scariest horror icons coming from around the country. It would make sense for many of those horror stories to take place in the tunnels. The Kyoto Tunnel isn't only the most haunted tunnel in Japan, but it's possibly the most haunted location of all by some accounts, though exactly why it's haunted is hard to say. It's approximately 500 meters long and is very narrow, and with only one lane of traffic being able to pass through at a time. It was built between 1927 and 1928 and designed for the Yuma Railway. The people working on the construction were mostly unpaid Korean laborers. Technically, it wasn't forced labor, but there were very few jobs available to Koreans in Kyoto at the time. There was a lot of construction happening at the time, in preparation for Emperor Hirohito's enthronement. Work was rushed and conditions were harsh. At one point, Korean workers went on strike due to the harsh conditions, which included physical punishment to try to make them work faster. How many people passed away while at the Kyoto Tunnel specifically hasn't been recorded. A local newspaper reported in September of 1928 that one person passed away in a landslide, but the legend surrounding the tunnel states that many more passed away during its construction. Some workers were left where they fell, while others were buried in unmarked graves nearby. When the railway opened, it ran until 1944. It was a relatively important line for pilgrims traveling to the Arago Jinja, but in 1944 it was deemed non-essential. The railway line was torn up and the tunnel was briefly used by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries during the war, before being converted to the road tunnel that it is today. When rumors of the haunting began are hard to say, with most people in the area having heard the stories at a young age. There are a number of factors to the haunting, which makes the Kyoto Tunnel stand out from other supposedly haunted tunnels. Due to how narrow the tunnel is, only one lane of traffic can travel through at a time. A traffic light is located at either end of the tunnel. One of the first rules about the tunnel is that if the light is green when the driver arrives, they should not enter. That's said to be a ghost beckoning the driver into the tunnel, and if they enter, then they'll meet a disturbing end. Instead, they must wait for the light to turn red and then green again before entering. Drivers should also not look at any mirrors. Some versions of the story state that this specifically refers to one of the mirrors at the end of the tunnel. If one were to look into this mirror, they would either see themselves passing away or not see anybody at all. The latter would mean that their own end would be coming quickly. Some versions of the story state this mirror effect is transferred to all mirrors in or around the tunnel, including ones on the driver's car. While driving through the tunnel, a driver might see a ghoulish figure in a mirror, which may cause an accident. Following these rules will usually ensure nothing too bad will happen, but that won't stop all the paranormal activity. There's said to be the ghost of a woman that will either jump onto the hood of the car or wait at the side of the tunnel, just watching the cars go by. Sometimes she won't be seen, but only heard screaming or chanting. The ghostly images of construction workers appear in cars. Some will describe the feeling of strong winds tugging on the car, only to find dirty handprints covering their car when they step out at the end of their journey. Even if no ghost is seen or heard, some motorists feel sick while driving through and develop headaches, with their car smelling rotten for hours or even days after they've passed through the tunnel. The paranormal activity is thought to increase at night, and there's even a sign advising people to look for other routes after dark. There are a number of explanations for this strange haunting. A study in a 2019 issue of the Japan Review found that most people in the local area weren't sure why the haunting had started, but where the stories of this strange haunting have been retold online, the answer is clear, with the haunting being blamed on the Korean construction workers. The 2019 reports point out how Japanese ghost stories tend to take place in liminal spaces, and the places on the edge of society. These are places that are different or other, as the Korean population was. Other possible theories put forward relate to the length of the tunnel. It's listed as being approximately 500 meters long. but some state that the exact length is actually 444 meters in length. The word for the number 4 in Japan sounds like the word for death, so having this length would be an extremely bad omen. However, another part of the story states that the tunnel is actually longer when traveling from one direction than the other. Another theory is that it was once the location of an ancient battle where a warlord lost his life. He cursed the very ground that the tunnel travels through. There are rational explanations for most of the concerns about the tunnel. For example, the bend in the tunnel makes it more likely that drivers will go quicker when traveling from one direction to the other. The traffic light ritual makes sense considering it's impossible to see traffic coming from the other direction before entering the tunnel, and it's possible that the light might turn red just after you enter, which might not give you enough time to get out before the light turns green on the other end. Even the sign warning people not to drive through at night can be explained by people in the neighboring village being disturbed by the sound of cars running through the echoey space late at night. But that doesn't explain the heavy feeling many get while approaching the tunnel, the feeling that there's something wrong with it, that they shouldn't go inside. Number 2. One of the many things that's debated in the paranormal field is just how and why ghosts come about. There are debates about whether ghosts must be attached to locations or people, or can be attached to objects. Are they people who have unfinished business, or simply people who became trapped in this world for no reason connected to themselves? Given the nature of the paranormal being unscientific, it's unlikely that we'll ever get answers to these questions. But these are questions that come up frequently in discussions about the Titanic Museum in Branson, Missouri. The Titanic is an interesting case when it comes to hauntings. There are a few single tragedies that have created so many different haunted locations. These range from the former home of Captain Edward John Smith, who's said to still haunt the Staffordshire home, or the actual wreck itself. Orbs of light have allegedly been seen above the location of the wreck. Given the wreck is now the grave of many of the 1,500 people who lost their lives, that might not be surprising. One theory is that our collective memory of the tragedy has kept these ghosts in the world attached to important locations, either where they once lived or where they passed away. But Branson, Missouri is neither of these things. The city is home to a replica of the famous ship that set sail and sank in 1912. From the outside, it looks like half a ship on land, complete with an iceberg. It's owned by John Jocelyn, one of the most knowledgeable people about the Titanic. When the wreck of the ship was finally discovered in 1985, Jocelyn knew that he needed to go down and see it for himself, and led an exhibition there 2 years later. In the years since, he's collected hundreds of artifacts from the Titanic. Some belong to those who managed to survive the sinking, while others belong to the people who would pass away. Artifacts including dining sets from first, second, and third classes, wedding bands, and a replica of the central staircase. Some areas inside the ship also look exactly as they would have been aboard the actual Titanic. The museum tries to make visitors feel as close to the passengers on the Titanic as possible, even giving visitors boarding passes on arrival, with information about one of the real individuals who set sail across the Atlantic. But some of the exhibitions apparently make people feel closer than anticipated. The site was opened in 2006. And within 3 years, there were already paranormal groups investigating reports of strange happenings. Staff at the museum have reported many ghostly happenings aboard the ship. Which artifacts these spirits are specifically attached to isn't known, though there are some locations where the activity is focused. The most startling thing for many is the experience of feeling significantly emotionally unbalanced, as if the final emotions of the people aboard the ship have seeped into the living person. The fact that visitors have information about a real person aboard the Titanic, but not whether or not they made it off, likely adds to that feeling of despair and fear. Others have heard the sound of sobs or screams coming from nowhere. Wet footprints, names being called from nowhere, and objects in the gift shops being knocked off the shelves are also common. There are at least 2 entities that are seen or felt often. The first is believed to be the ghost of John Jacob Astor IV. Astor was a business and real estate mogul, and one of the richest people alive at the time. He was the richest person aboard the Titanic, and was accompanied by his wife Madeline, her nurse, a maid, a valet, and their dog. At first, Astor hadn't believed there was any reason to be alarmed, and Madeline was one of the last first-class women to be placed into one of the lifeboats. Her nurse and maid joined her, but Astor would not survive. He was supposedly last seen smoking on the starboard bridge wing, about half an hour before the ship disappeared beneath the surface. Astor was one of only about 300 bodies to be recovered. Many artifacts relating to the Astors have wound up on display in various museums, and it's possible one or more made their way to the Missouri Museum, as it seems his ghost has. The smell of cigar smoke is often smelled near the first-class elevators, and the full-body apparition of a man in a black suit is seen on the replica staircase. This is believed to be Astor. It's an interesting ghost, especially when it comes to the questions of why ghosts haunt certain locations. Other, more prominent Astor-related artifacts have wound up at other museums, but this is the one that has apparently captured the spirit's attention. But there is another, much more interactive ghost. This spirit is of a much younger person who likes to haunt the musician's room. This is a room dedicated to the band that played while the Titanic sank. There's a piano in the room, and sometimes performers will play the final song the musicians performed before going underwater. The little spirit also likes to play the piano sometimes. This figure isn't a full-bodied apparition like Astor, but it's often felt like a cold spot. It's also felt in different parts of the ship, including the captain's bridge and promenade deck. It's a playful spirit and will communicate with some paranormal detecting devices, but the eeriest sign of its presence is the child-sized handprints that appear from nowhere. Some have even claimed that these prints appeared before their eyes. This couldn't be explained away as an ordinary child passing through the exhibit before visitors. The Titanic Museum was featured on the Travel Channel's Ghost Adventures, and the child spirit was active again. Using a structure light sensor in the captain's bridge, the team picked up the presence of a small human anomaly. The spirit played around for a short while, balancing on the railings, before it could be seen jumping through one of the windows. When the team looked at the windows again, new handprints had appeared. The spirit then made its presence known in the musician's room, where it apparently leapt to. It's not known if there's more than one of these child spirits that haunts the museum. Like many haunted locations, even without the haunted aspect, the Titanic Museum can be a somewhat chilling reminder of a tragedy that involved real people who each had their own story and reason for being aboard the ship. Number 1. Akershus Fortress was first built in the 1290s. Any place that's been around for over 700 years is bound to have one or two ghost stories. The castle has more than its fair share and is believed to be one of the most haunted places in Norway. The medieval castle is located in Oslo, overlooking Oslo Fjord. Its location makes it incredibly difficult to attack, as many armies would find. But it was also very important. Overlooking the fjord, it meant that nothing could go in or out of the country without the forces there noticing. That meant that whoever controlled the castle effectively controlled the country. For that reason, it became the scene of many battles and sieges, and the echoes of those can still sometimes be heard today. Akershus never fell during a siege, and while that's mostly due to the perfect location and the skill of its defenders, it's possible there may have been some supernatural elements on their side. The history of the castle is a long and brutal one. Work began in the 1290s under the orders of King Haakon V. He was mostly concerned about attacks from other Norwegian noblemen, but it would be a Swedish duke that first tested the castle's defenses in 1308. Eric of Södermanland would not be able to force his way into the castle. Akershus stood strong, as it would during the many sieges that came from Sweden and elsewhere in Norway. Even the Swedish king's forces couldn't force their way in. Later, the fortress would be improved by King Christian IV, who made it into the Renaissance castle and strengthened the defenses. Christian would also rebuild Oslo to be behind the castle after a fire ruined the old city. The layout of the city was designed so cannon fire from the castle could attack invaders at a distance. The castle never fell in a siege, but it was surrendered to German invaders during the Second World War. It would later be recaptured and continues to serve as a military area to this day. The castle was surrendered to Germany during the Second World War, and Norwegian resistance fighters were locked up at Akershus. After the end of the war, Norwegian traitors were held. The fortress was used for many purposes over the hundreds of years that it stood, sometimes simultaneously, and it seems each of those purposes has at least one ghost attached to it. When it comes to the defensive role that the castle played, there's the so-called vicious dog. According to legend, a fierce guard dog was buried alive beneath the main gate. This was a strategic weak point in the castle, especially as it faced the direction that invaders would come from. It was thought that the spirit of such a fierce dog would add to the defensive capabilities of the gate. Some stories say that even seeing the dog means doom, while others state that the dog must bite the victim. The person will then pass away within the next 3 months. That was not always in battle. One story tells of a commander who was attacked by the ghost of the dog and passed away in an accident weeks later. Other ghosts relate to the defense of the castle, or the sounds of battle that can sometimes be heard, and phantom echoes of a battle that happened hundreds of years ago. But the castle wasn't only used for defense. For much of its history, it was also a royal residence. It's still used today as a mausoleum and for hosting foreign heads of state. 2 of the royals that once lived there were Håkon IV, King of Norway, and his wife Margaret I of Denmark, who ruled over Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. During Håkon's rule, there was a plague, which in turn caused a famine. Norway was one of the hardest hit countries by the recent Black Death, and had barely started to recover when the next sickness began to spread. According to the stories, even those within the castle did not have enough to eat. Håkon and Margaret survived, but Margaret's chambermaid was not so lucky. She passed away at some point during the winter, and her ghost is still said to wander the halls of the castle. That's one of the explanations for the ghost of a woman wearing a long, dark cloak, who does not have a face. But other possible suggestions for the woman's identity have been put forward, including that she may have been locked in a castle chamber. A third use for the castle was as a prison. This was one of the castle's purposes up until 1950. Over the years, the prisoners changed from Robin Hood-style folk heroes, like Ol Hoyland, to rebellion leaders to war prisoners. Many prisoners would lose their lives in the fortress walls. Some believe the ghost of Ol Hoyland can still be found in the castle. Hoyland was a thief and escape artist, escaping from prison 11 times, including one successful attempt from Akershus. He was captured 3 years after the escape and brought back to Akershus, where he would remain until he passed away. These are far from the only ghosts believed to have remained at the castle. Another strange ghost is that of a horse. While all the Swedish sieges didn't work, a drunken Swedish soldier did manage to storm into the castle on a horse. He declared he was now king and taking over Norway. He didn't survive the night, and his horse also passed away. The horse is said to still haunt the castle. While the drunken soldier himself isn't seen, his screams are still sometimes heard. Most of the ghosts at Akershus seem harmless, and may not even be aware of the modern world going on around them. Visitors should be cautious of the vicious dog, though, which still guards the Maiden Tower, and could be a chilling warning of some upcoming disaster. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.